Good morning and welcome back to I Survived Mount St. Helens. I think we last left them. They went back to the cabin to grab some, I think, fishing gear for the twins' dad, and then Jess was going to look for the camera, and there was a big blast. So, kaboom. Chapter 12, Sunday, May 18, 8:32 a.m. The blast seemed to shatter the sky. A huge black cloud shot up over the tree line. Jess's legs turned to jelly. "That's just a steam explosion, right?" Sam asked weakly. But they all knew it wasn't. This angry black cloud looked nothing like the wispy gray plumes that they had seen from Cedar. It boiled wildly and spread out all around until it had painted the entire sky a furious black. There was a loud whoosh that shook the ground. A blast of searing hot wind knocked them off their feet. The air seemed to turn to fire. Jess had never felt such heat. It was hotter than the diner kitchen on a broiling August day, hotter than Mom's oven when she was baking bread. The pyroclastic surge, Jess realized, the fiery hurricane wind packed with poisonous gas and ash. It was the killer wind that had destroyed St. Pierre. The heat blasted over them, and Jess felt as though she was being cooked from the inside out. Every breath was like inhaling fire. The heat blasted over them. I just read that. She looked around with desperation, knowing that they wouldn't last more than a few seconds if they stood here. Just a few yards away was a huge hole, one of the grave-like pits caused by the earthquake. It was wide and at least 10 feet deep. Almost without thinking, Jess grabbed hold of the twins, gripping their arms with all her might. "There!" she cried, yanking them toward the huge pit. It was their only hope. They all jumped in. Jess came down hard on her shoulder. She bit her tongue and tasted blood. So there they are, jumping into the pit. But she barely noticed. There was only heat, terrible blistering heat. "Get in the dirt!" Jess screamed. They all dug frantically into the sides of the hole, trying to tunnel in. Jess tore at the earth until her fingers were bleeding, until she had created enough space for her head and shoulders. She jammed herself in and then pulled her legs to her chest so she was a little ball pushed into the dirt. The air grew hotter until she was sure the entire world had burst into flames. The volcano thundered and roared. Dirt and mud and bits of rock rained down. There were terrible moaning shrieks of trees falling above. Jess thought of her great-grandfather Clive. No wonder he hated the sound of that. Jess kept herself pushed into the dirt, but it was very hard to breathe. Finally, the air started to cool down. Jess uncurled her body and stood in the hole. But she had barely taken a breath when a tree came down, crashing over the hole. Bam! A branch smacked her in the head. And then there was no more heat, no more pain, just darkness. Chapter 13, 10 minutes later. Jess opened her eyes, but she couldn't see. She brushed the dirt from her eyes and blinked, but there was still only darkness. Was it night? Had she gone blind? Jess sat up, gasping at the searing pain that raked across her back. She had been badly burned, she could tell. It took a moment for her mind to clear, and slowly she grasped the full horror of what was happening. St. Helens was erupting. The smoke had turned the day black. The pyroclastic surge had exploded over them. Somehow, they were still alive in this hole in the ground. "Sam?" she choked. "Eddie?" A voice rasped from somewhere else. Somewhere close. "I'm here," Sam said softly. "Eddie's hurt." Jess inched over, groping in the darkness until her fingers brushed their faces. She felt tears. Jess fought back her own tears and took a deep breath. She tried to stand, but the fallen tree imprisoned them in the hole. It would be impossible to try to climb out in the dark. They had to wait here until the sky lightened. But when would that be? The mountain roared. Every few minutes there was a new explosion that rattled Jess's bones. Jess couldn't control her fear. She finally started to cry, but luckily the mountain drowned out the sound. Jess felt something falling on her head. Warm flakes. Ash, she realized. It began as a few sprinkles, falling lightly like hot snow. And then, suddenly, they were in an ash blizzard. The warm flakes swirled up Jess's nose and into her mouth. She covered her face, but it did no good. The flakes completely filled the air. The ash tasted disgusting, like dirt mixed with chalk. It clogged up her nose and blocked off her throat. She coughed hard and blew her nose and spit out mouthfuls. But it was coming down too quickly. She couldn't clear her nose and mouth fast enough. The boys hacked and gagged too. They would all suffocate if this kept up. Then Jess had an idea. "Pull your shirt over your face," she cried. Jess reached below her red sweatshirt for her t-shirt. She pulled it up over her face. It worked. The shirt became a mask that filtered out the ash. She could breathe again. They sat in the pit with their faces covered for a long time, waiting for the blizzard to stop. The mountain growled and boomed. Jess huddled close to the boys. She realized that there could only be one thing worse than being in the middle of this horror. Being here alone, without the twins. I wonder where the dad is. Chapter 14, 1 hour later. At last, the ash blizzard stopped. A thick coating of the warm flakes covered their heads and shoulders. Jess spit and coughed and wiped her eyes. The sky had lightened up. Finally, she could see well enough to climb through the tangle of limbs that covered the hole. She made her way up until she was high enough to see the forest. Except, it was no longer a forest. It was a graveyard of fallen trees. Every single tree was down. Thousands and thousands of trees. The force of the blast and the surge had ripped most of them right out of the ground. 200-foot trees knocked over like popsicle sticks. Some had been uprooted, others snapped like twigs. If Jess and the twins hadn't been deep in that hole, they all would have been crushed. The cabin was smashed under a huge fir tree. Everything was covered with a thick coating of gray ash. But there was a sight even worse than the ruined forest. The mountain. With the trees down, Jess now had a perfect view of St. Helens. Or what was left of St. Helens. It looked as though it had been smashed by a giant hammer. Its sparkling peak was gone. In its place was a gaping black mouth vomiting up smoke. Jess had never seen anything so hideous. She slammed her eyes shut and turned away. She climbed back down into the hole again. And now she finally could really see the boys. Their faces were plastered white with ash and smeared with blood. They looked like two battered ghosts. Sam was staring down. Jess followed his gaze to his thigh. His pants were torn. What was that on his leg? It didn't look like skin. It looked ripped up and blackened like burned meat. Jess gasped. "Oh, Sam!" And then she looked at Eddie. She couldn't see his wounds, but from the glazed look in his eyes, she could see that he was badly hurt too. Both boys were shivering. They needed to find help. Now. But how? The boys couldn't stand, and Jess wouldn't be able to carry even one of them out. It was hopeless. They would have to sit here and wait for help to come. Jess looked up, praying that she'd see Mr. Rowan peering down into the hole. But how would he get to them? It would take hours, even days, for anyone to make it through the maze of fallen trees. Jess had to get help. But what if there was another eruption? What if another fiery hurricane swept over the forest? What if she got lost? 100 terrible questions swirled through her mind, and none had answers. But that didn't matter, Jess realized. "I'm gonna go get help," she said, fighting back tears. I'll be back very soon." The boys didn't seem to hear her. Both seemed to be drifting away. Sam's eyes were closed. He was shivering harder now. Jess gently took Sam's cold hand and laid it on her palm. She lifted Eddie's hand and put it on top of Sam's. She rested her other hand on top of Eddie's. She gripped both boys' hands tightly within her own. "All for one," she said to herself, "and one for all." For the first time, Jess really understood what those words meant. Jess would do anything to help the boys. She would even face the volcano by herself. Chapter 15. But which way should she go? Jess looked around, trying to understand where she was. The trail was gone. Nothing looked familiar. It was as though she had crash-landed on a distant planet, a smoking, ash-covered land. The only landmarks were the smashed shack and the mountain. Dad had taught her to use the sun as a guide, but the sun was blotted out by the ash and the smoke. Jess decided that if she walked with the volcano on her left, she could at least be heading back toward the parking lot. Then maybe she could find Mr. Rowan. If she couldn't, at least she'd be close to the road. It was so hot that her clothes were sticking to her sweat-soaked skin. Jess stripped off her sweatshirt and dropped it over a branch. Then she took a breath and set out. She walked between fallen trees, and when there was no room between the trees, she climbed up and walked along their trunks. Everything was covered with inches of ash, and in some spots it was very hot. The air smelled like rotten eggs and smoke. Her back throbbed with pain. But even worse was the thirst. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her tongue swollen and sandpaper dry. She hadn't had a sip of water since she'd left home. How long ago was that? Just this morning, this forest had been crisscrossed by creeks filled with clear, rushing water. On her camping trips with Dad, they'd scooped up water right from the streams and gulped it down without a worry. But now every stream she passed was ruined. The ash had turned the sparkling water to thick gray sludge that stank of sulfur. Just the thought of trying to swallow a mouthful was nauseating. The sounds of the volcano pounded in her ears. It roared, it thundered, it boomed. Bolts of lightning shot through the churning cloud above. Her footsteps kicked up clouds of ash that burned her eyes. But Jess ignored the pain and the thirst and the volcano's roar. She fought the swirl of terrifying thoughts that streamed through her mind. Instead, she pictured Dad's hopeful eyes. She imagined her great-grandfather Clive Marlowe tramping through these very woods alone when he was just a few years older than Jess. She tried to hear her mom's voice. "Whatever happens, you and I will make it through." But what really kept her moving was Sam and Eddie, her best friends. For as long as Jess could remember, they had been right there with her. In those terrible months after Dad died, the twins had hardly even left her side. They'd even slept on the floor of her room. She pictured their freckled faces, imagined the feel of their hands. Jess stumbled along for hours, for miles, she was sure. The parking lot was nowhere in sight. She was afraid she might be walking in circles. And then she came into a big field, a place she had never seen before. And that's when she realized she was completely lost. She crouched down on the hot, ashy ground, too exhausted to even cry. Every inch of her body ached. Her lungs burned from the ash. She had never imagined that she could be so thirsty. If only she could sleep for a little while. Everything would be better when she woke up. The sky would be blue again. The mountain would be quiet. All of this would be over. She let her eyes drift closed. She had the feeling of letting go, of floating away. The pain and the thundering noise faded. No! She forced herself to stand up. What was she thinking? She had to keep going. She had to help find the twins. Find help for the twins. She could not give up. And that's when she noticed a new sound. Not a roar, or a boom, or a whoosh. Thwack, 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 thwack. A helicopter. Jess leaped to her feet and searched the sky. And there it was, a yellow chopper flying in circles. She jumped up and waved. "Hey, hey, here I am!" But of course they couldn't hear her. And she was so covered with ash, she was just another speck of gray in the endless ash sea. How would they see her? The helicopter disappeared, and then it circled back a minute later. Jess jumped up and waved, but it flew away again. The pilot couldn't see her. What could Jess do? How could she get their attention before they flew away? And then it came to her. She found a big branch and snapped off a stick covered with leaves. She used it to sweep the ground around her, to create a huge cloud of ash that rose up like a smoke signal. And then she ran out in front of it, waving her arms. Hold on. Okay, there we go. The helicopter slowed. It swooped down a bit and hovered over her. A man leaned out and waved. He shouted through a bullhorn, "We're coming down for you!" A wave of relief almost knocked Jess to the ground. The thwack, 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 thwack got louder and louder until it drowned out the sound of the volcano. The wind from the propeller kicked up so much ash that Jess could barely see. But moments later, a man in a bright orange vest appeared out of the cloud. He knelt down. "You okay?" he shouted. Jess didn't answer for a second, but then she nodded. She was okay. He helped Jess up and started to lead her to the chopper. "No!" she cried. "I can't leave my friends here. They're hurt. We gotta go get them." "Where are they?" Jess turned and pointed to the wasteland all around them. "Somewhere out there." "Okay," he said calmly. "Let's get up in the air. They're gonna help us find them. You're gonna help us find them." Sorry. And so, minutes later, Jess was strapped into the back seat of a 4-seat helicopter. The pilot was up front, and the man in the vest was next to her. He gave her a thermos of water and big earphones to protect her ears from the engine noise. So she looked out the window, combing the ground with her eyes. But everything looked the same, ash-covered trees as far as she could see. The air was filled with smoke. It was almost impossible to see anything. How would they ever spot the twins? But then Jess saw it, a flash of red. Her sweatshirt. Her heart leaped up. "There!" Jess cried. "There they are!" The man tapped the pilot's shoulder and pointed down. The helicopter swooped around and headed for the twins. She had found them. All right, we're going to stop there. Have a good day.